I am excited and humbled to welcome you to this important call. For those of you who may not know, the American Constitution Society, ACS, is the nation's largest progressive legal network. ACS believes that the Constitution is of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Constitution and our laws must be interpreted in light of the text, history, and lived experience of our vibrant and diverse country. Our nation's institutions and centers of power should reflect these diverse experiences and work to lift up all people rather than seek to attack and disenfranchise those who do not have a seat at the table. Through a diverse nationwide network of progressive lawyers, law students, judges, scholars, and many others, we work to uphold the Constitution in the 21st century by ensuring that law is a force for protecting our democracy and the public interest and for improving people's lives. As ACS President Russ Feingold mentioned during the ACS Virtual National Convention, far too many people in this country do not feel seen, protected, or comfortable with our laws, which we heard echoed from law students around the country. Our work is not just about the academic aspects of the law or a battle over constitutional theory. It is about the reality of what the Constitution and the law means for people on the ground. We are committed to fighting for a progressive future, a future where Black lives matter. If you'd like to learn more about how to get engaged with ACS, please let us know by emailing us at campus@acslaw.org. Before we move on to the main program tonight, I'd like to thank our co-hosts, Professor Michelle Goodwin and the National Black Law Students Association, for working to put together this much needed discussion. And on the ACS staff, huge thanks to Peggy Lee for her part in organizing this. Thank you also to our incredible speakers for taking the time to share with us their perspectives, stories, wisdom, and expertise. Lastly, we wanted to give a huge thank you to Professor Michelle Goodwin, who worked tirelessly to bring this event together. Thank you, Michelle, for all the work that you put into this event and for providing us with the honor of working with you and many others on this program. Now for a brief introduction of tonight's speakers. As a note, all speaker biographies are listed on the ACS event page for this event, which you can find at acslaw.org/events. Tesra Abe is a recent graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, where she was the secretary of the Michigan chapter of the Black Law Students Association. Rachel Barnes is the chair of the National Black Law Students Association. She is a 3L JD MBA student at the University of Virginia School of Law. Professor Guy Uriel Charles is the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law and co-director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics at Duke Law School. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics, and race. Professor Michelle Goodwin is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at the University of California, Irvine. She is a nationally recognized advocate for civil liberties and civil rights and is at the forefront of health policy discourse. Dean Danielle Holly Walker is the Dean and Professor of Law at Howard University School of Law. Her ongoing research agenda deals with the governance of public schools and diversity in the legal profession. Professor Patricia Williams is the University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern University School of Law. She is a MacArthur Fellowship alumnus and the author of The Alchemy of Race and Rights, which was named one of the 25 best books of 1991 by the Voice Literacy Supplement. Last but certainly not least, Marquisa Wentz is the Vice Chair of the National Black Law Students Association. She is a concurrent degree student completing her JD at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law and her Master of Public Service at the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. I will now pass the mic over to today's moderator, the incredible Professor Michelle Goodwin.
Thank you so much for that, Zanelle, and for the American Constitution Society hosting this important call for us this evening. This webinar that we record, but also live stream across the country, a conversation to elevate the experiences of Black lives at American law schools. And really it's a conversation that we could be having not just about law schools, but medical schools and so much more. So tonight, as we begin to unpack the realities of what educating Black people has been in the country, what draws us here in many ways has also been the violence against Black bodies, the violence that we saw against Breonna Taylor and also George Floyd, which led to people getting into the street. But in many ways, it's been somewhat of a pornography of pain that Black people have had to endure and experience in order to make real and visible to others exactly what living in America sometimes can be if you are Black. We know and we have seen instances of Black people who have been gunned down, who have, while sitting in their cars, while driving, while walking, by so many other, kind of means we've seen violence. And that violence is not just Jim Crow violence. What we see is a kind of modern day iteration of this. And this has triggered now concerns about what anti-Blackness means in America. And there have been some very brave students across the country, including my co-host this evening, Tez Rabi, who is joining me and who will serve as my co-moderator. She's a recent graduate from the University of Michigan, as you've heard, but as well the leaders of BALSA, of the National BALSA. Rachel Barnes is with me this evening. She chairs the National BALSA, and also Marquisa Wentz, who is the vice chair, and they are pretty dynamic folks. So when I think about what brings us together, it is the contemporary, but it's also important to remember the legacy and history in this particular space. The legacy and history of segregation in American schools, the fight that Black parents have had to endure in order to make sure that their kids could receive an education. The very drama of someone like Ruby Bridges integrating a school with law enforcement coming with her. Governors who stared down students as they sought to enter America's colleges. States that rather than admitting their own homegrown African Americans, choosing instead to pay tuition to out-of-state schools so that they would not have to integrate their colleges, their law schools, their medical schools. And let's be clear that when we talk about education in America, it is not just the institutions themselves, but other organizations that have also engaged in that kind of segregationist kinds of policy. If you think about medicine, for example, or you think about law, the exclusion of Black people from the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, and so much more. So when we have this discussion tonight, it's important to understand the histories that actually bring us to this space and the persistence of certain types of discrimination and various harms that students experience at their law schools, the invisibility, and when they try to bring these issues visibly, the ways in which they get shut down, or that others will say, we've heard about that, but we need not do anything about it. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marquisa Wentz. As I've mentioned, she is the vice chair of the National BALSA. She'll give remarks, and following that will be Rachel Barnes, who is the chair of the National BALSA.
Thank you so much, Professor Goodwin. I'm so glad to be here this evening, and I want to take this time to speak to the concerns of law students everywhere, and to highlight our voices, but also to take this opportunity to call administration to action during this time. But first, to my students, my fellow students out here in the streets, not only tackling the books, tackling these summer classes and clerkships, but fighting for your Black bodies to be seen, to be heard within your schools, but outside your schools as well. I see you, I'm with you, and we were put here during this time for a reason. Everything that you need to continue on in this fight is within you. I know you're tired, we hear you, and we stand with you, not only as NABOLSA, but as fellow students. And I've seen an amount of collective power and organizing amongst law students that has inspired me to continue fighting and to stay committed to this work. I'm talking about organizing to make sure that there are bail funds and representation to protesters. I'm talking about organizing to call out financial ties within institutions and universities that are upholding the prison industrial complex. Students are organizing, Black students are organizing in this fight. to be seen and to be heard and to have a more safe and inclusive learning environment did not start a month ago. It did not start 2 months ago. And I know the fight has to continue. It is our duty to see this through. And I personally am inspired to continue adding to that fight. And at NABOLSA, we are committed to making sure that we continue to use our platform and continue to build on the legacy of making sure that we're not only increasing the number of law students, but making sure that we're protecting and maintaining safe and inclusive learning environments for all law students. For administration, now is the time to put action to those plans. Now is the time to make sure that your diversity statements that are displayed on your websites are more than words. That looks like funding opportunities for your students to attend programming that is put on by us for us. That looks like not making your students fight for funding to put on BOLSA programming or attend national BOLSA programming. That looks like taking a look at your books and seeing how your money is being spent. It looks like making sure that there are mandated trainings and anti-racist policies being implemented, and there are actionable plans in place that your faculty, administration, staff are mandated to attend and partake on a continuous basis. That includes students as well. As a minority on campuses, a lot of our students and our cohort are not knowledgeable on issues. They do not want to be knowledgeable on issues. And that puts us in a position of not only getting our own education, but educating others on how to respect us as Black students. That is not our job. It is not the job of Black law students to hold your hand through this process and addressing these long-standing systemic issues. So I call you all to the plate. I call you all to make sure that there's action being taken continuously and to support the Black students as well as faculty on your campus to make sure that we continue to address these issues throughout the year, throughout the time, and that this is not a one-time statement. And in these statements that we're making sure that we're clear that we're fighting for Black law students right now. We're fighting for Black faculty right now. This is not an all student problem. This is disproportionately affecting Black students. So let's be clear in how we're standing and addressing and purporting to support our students right now. So again, I want to just shout out all the students out here continuing to grind and continuing to make it happen. So thank you all so much. And I'm looking forward, hungry to get this wisdom and to hear from all the amazing speakers that we have on tonight.
Thank you so much for that, Marquise. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Barnes now.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin. And thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'd like to echo her words of support and love for the Black community, not just Black law students, not just Black professors, but the Black community, because each of us influences the other and we are a family, we are a community. So it's essential that we all recognize that and continue to support each other in love and kindness and respect. Beyond that, I want to say that from the National Black Law Students perspective, what we're hoping to do going forward is mobilize and help organize and support our law students and our BOLSA chapters as they try to implement social action and impacts on their campus, from changing names at law schools, for advocating for greater funding in the schools for programming, to greater respect and inclusion in the classrooms. As Professor Goodwin mentioned, there is a modernization of the racism and exclusion of Black students in law schools. When you have professors like Amy Wax in Penn Law stating in class that Black law students and minority students cannot succeed in the lawyer profession. And as we all know, or as many of us know, 5% is what we make up in the Black law in the law profession. And that number only gets worse when you get into big law, where it's maybe 3%. And that representation, lack of representation and lack of support starts in the law school environment, which is why NABOLSA was created. And we, at 50 plus years later, are still continuing to fight and advocate for our students and for our members, because we want to ensure that we do increase the number of Black law students who are excelling and succeeding in the law school profession, or the legal profession, excuse me. So I want to take this time to thank ACS and thank Professor Goodwin for including Nabalsa in this very important discussion, because it's something that we don't often amplify, and it's important to give the perspectives of not only law students, but Black professors, because some of you were law students, and it's important to show that this is an avenue that we can succeed in as well, and that deserves to be respected and heard. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. And, you know, on that point, you're right. Represented amongst you are professors, and also Dean Holly Walker, and also Professor Guy Uriel Charles, who was actually the acting dean when I joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota. And really behind so much of this is a kind of intimacy, because there are so few Black people, relatively speaking, within these spaces, that there is really only 1 or 2 degrees of separation. After all, I was at UVA and met you when you came to my office when I was visiting there. It was Professor Guy Uriel Charles who helped recruit me to the University of Minnesota. It was the very generous Professor Patricia Williams, whom I met when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, who opened her arms when I just came by as a freshman or sophomore undergraduate to just talk to her. So I really appreciate this moment of intimacy amongst us all. Faculty, I turn it over to you.
Well, if you don't mind, Professor Goodwin, it's wonderful to see you again. And of course, one of the smartest decisions we made at the time at the University of Minnesota is to recruit you to that faculty. Let me share, just for very briefly, something that I shared with some of folks here at the University of Duke University with respect to how I understand some of the struggles that the students are talking about. And I want to start with this particular statement, and I won't be too long. There's a Black man running down the street. Someone called 911 to report that there's a Black man running down the street. And a different person called into 911 and to report that there's a man in a house right now. And the dispatcher asked whether that man was a trespasser, was he breaking in? And the caller replied, no, the house is open, it's under construction. Then the caller said he is running now. The dispatcher asked, well, what is he doing? And the caller replied, he is running down the street. My guess is that all of you have probably recognized that I'm describing the events surrounding the death and murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And when I first heard the story, I was struck and fixated by the statement, there's a Black man, and it could have been a Black woman running down the street. The statement was uttered as if its implications were self-evident, meaning that there's somebody who doesn't belong. How do we know that they don't belong? Well, it's race and it's our street. We know that this Black person does not belong because he's Black and because he's invading our space. And when I hear some of the students around the law schools talk about their experiences, I reflect on the relationship between race and space, and how one's race, in particular one's Blackness, marks a person as an outsider. And the question that we often ask is a question of belonging. Who belongs in this space? Who belongs at this law school? Who belongs at this university? And to the extent that Blackness marks one as an outsider. And I think part of what we're coming to terms with is addressing the marker that race has imposed from the very beginning in this country, a marker of outsiderness, and how we can truly claim these institutions as our own, and we could truly belong. And when I hear the students talk, these are some of the things that come to mind.
Thank you very much for that. Dean Holly Walker, would you like to chime in? And let's be clear, and someone has mentioned in the chat, and let's be clear, the earliest persons at our academic institutions, and they continue to be, are the people who clean up after everyone. And Pat, you have written in memoir form about your aunt, the people who cook the food for people to be able to eat. the very women and men whose children could not attend these institutions, even state institutions where they paid taxes into the coffers that allowed these institutions to actually be, their children could not attend. People famously remember the story of Thurgood Marshall, but beyond Thurgood Marshall, there are so many other Black people who were denied the opportunity to attend the very state schools in which they were raised. And so thank you very much for your commentary about Black staff, because the legacy of discrimination extends beyond just students and faculty. Its very beginnings and origins were Black enslaved people forced without compensation to build these institutions, especially throughout the South. Dean Holly Walker.
Thank you so much, Professor Goodwin, for inviting me to be here this evening. I just want to thank ACS and also BALSA for having this event. I think it is so critical for us right now to support our students and to talk about the way that as law schools, it is impossible for us to really advocate on behalf of Black Lives Matter unless we start at home. Right? We have to start in our own institutions. And I want to go right to what Marquisa was talking about in terms of holding ourselves accountable, right? So one of the things that always interests me is when these things happen, you know, when we see the murder of George Floyd, when we see the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, when we talk about Breonna Taylor, you know, law school deans, the same as we see corporations and we see others inside, issue statements, right? And I've always been very hesitant to do that. I want the work of Howard's Law School to speak for itself. I don't want it to be something that is about statements, so I always hesitate to do that. So when I saw that pretty much every law school dean issued a statement in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, one thing that Danielle Conway, the dean at Dickinson School of Law, said, let's not this be a moment of statements, right? But instead be a moment of action. And so Dean Conway, Dean Angela Nawachi-Willig, Dean Carla Pratt, right now we are seeing the largest number of Black women as deans ever in the history of our law schools. And I think that we are seeing what is coming from that. These women joined together and I worked with them to create something called the AALS, the American Association of Law Schools Anti-Racist Clearinghouse. And what that clearinghouse has in it is a collection of all those statements, but more importantly, it's a call to action for law schools to hold ourselves accountable, right? To not point the finger and say, okay, you know, you police officers need to hold yourself accountable if we can't hold ourselves accountable, right? We have to start by looking internally as we are doing the work of ending police violence, ending police brutality. So some of the questions that we asked, Marquisa, you hit it right on the head. We've asked every law school, and you should ask your deans and academic leadership, are they engaged in an internal audit? That's what we have called for. The internal audit asks questions like, what are the demographics of your student body? And are those demographics achieving representation? What are the demographics of your faculty and staff? Who has status in your institution? We're asking important questions like, are the Black students in your school disproportionately paying more for their education and thereby subsidizing and discounted tuition for non-Black students? Are the ways of defining merit and eligibility for law review and moot court equitable to students of color? Do you recommend that students to the bar who have engaged in conduct demonstrating racial animus during law school? So asking that students who engage in that kind of question be really, that kind of behavior be held accountable on their bar certification forms. So I hope that every student on their call, on this call, will ask for accountability from their deans, from their academic leadership. You can tell them that I told you to ask, right? They can send me a nice email about it, but we all put out these statements, so we all should be ready to audit our own behavior. I would also say that it's important as academic leadership for us to follow our students. I'm a strong believer in that. My students at Howard University School of Law, they've organized rallies, know your rights trainings, jail support, bail support efforts. They're advocating for policy reform. I want to support them in what they do, right? To let them lead, and for us as an institution to support them. I'd also ask students to inquire about what is your institutional support for the Black Lives Matter movement. So at Howard, we've created something called the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. We filed injunctions to help end the curfews for protesters in DC and New York. We're working with the Inter-American Commission with Michael Brown's mother on making the case for her son in the international forum. So really ask, what is the institutional support that's been put behind supporting Black Lives Matter at your law school? I think that's a critical question for us to have. So thank you so much for having me here this evening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Dean Holly Walker. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Professor Patricia Williams, for further comment. And I want to make sure that we also talk about the personal too as professors, because that's also a part that's missing in the conversation. What are the lives like of Black staff, of Black faculty at these institutions? Why is it that students sometimes feel alienated from the professors that actually are there? And more than likely at institutions, there aren't many Black faculty at all. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Pat.
There. I think that one of the things that that you bring to mind, Michelle, is when I first met you and when I first met Guy. I am of an age where I was, still young, but the most senior person for miles around, simply because there were so few of us. And there were so few of us that, as you put it, I reached out and hugged you because, you would go to a AALS meeting and there would be thousands of people there. I began teaching in 1980, thousands of people. There weren't even any women at that time. There were so few women. My class in law school was 8% women and you can imagine how few of those were women of color or people of color generally. And so some things have changed. It is dispiriting on the one hand to see how few or what a small percentage of the overall population we are to this day. On the other hand, I do get a little thrilled when I think that just on this call, there are this many people, hundreds. And so I have a bit of a long view about this. And so if it's any help, I want to remind people what it was like not that long ago. When I started teaching, there were 6 people of color, women of color, I should say, 6 women of color in the entire United States, including at the traditionally Black schools. There were 4 African-American women, 1 Asian-American woman, and 1 Latina. And this was also a day in which many of the law schools at which I taught didn't have a women's room. They would have like a public bathroom on the first floor or in the public area, but you'd have to, if you were a faculty member, you'd have to climb down the stairs to find a bathroom. There were bathroom wars, so this was an issue of both women and women of color. And the degree to which that has changed at a snail's pace is also testament to the loneliness of this profession. And so I guess I want to underscore the degree to which we need to be very, very supportive on the one hand, but also very patient with each other. That I think that there is a kind of inherently urgent sense of impatience that we can change the world and we must change the world right now. But I also want to underwrite that with a sense of making sure you take care of yourselves. That part of the agenda of serving others has to be taking care of yourself, taking care of yourselves. And if you're the only one in an environment or the only one in a class, you need to seek company. And if that company is not serving you well, find a therapist. Go to a meditation center. Do something that allows you to continue. Because the hardest part of my entire career has been the loneliness that this has imposed of being in environments which are not only hostile, in which are not only singular, in which are not only exceptionalized, but as Guy said, you're also inherently out of place. The very sight of you is out of place. and that is psychically scarring. So take care of that. The there, you know, the charge for what we do as lawyers is again a lifelong charge, and change the institution, if not within the 3 years that you're in law school, then by leaving records, legacy, tracking, writing everything down so that the next group of students can come in and build upon your work. And that takes thought and patience. I'm also really struck by the sense of the isolation, which has described my career and my lofty years, is so exacerbated at this moment by COVID, by the sense of muffled communion that Zoom, this surveyed technological mechanism through which, yes, we are privileged to connect, but it is also quite a muting technology, I think. And, you know, for those of us who are quarantined or don't have necessary easy access to the outdoors, I think this is a time of even more stress. So be careful with yourselves. This is like being in solitary confinement. I find, again, that if I cannot always find immediate colleagues, for me, my, you know, the solace that I find is frequently in writing. This is a time to write and to connect through the winter of this incredible slew of despond, to write as much as you possibly can, as to leave a record of this extraordinary historical moment. Again, I wish you all the best. I do also advise that you reach out to your faculty, because some, particularly in institutions where there are very few of you, your faculty is as stressed and as lonely as you are. And sometimes it helps, as when Michelle came by my office and I perked up immediately. But I did, frankly, at the beginning of my career, spend a great deal of time hiding in my office, because it was not always easy just to go out and expose myself. So have a little faith that if you are miserable, your faculty are fighting the same stresses, and you can be of enormous support to one another, and extend the courtesies and the comforts of patience with each other through these extraordinary times.
You know, before we go to our Q&A, and I'd like to inform our listeners, if you do have questions, please put them in the question box. You can begin doing that now. So rather than the chat, put them there. But I would like to turn to the personal and then open up to Marquisa and Rachel for any comments that you might have based on what you're hearing, and then we'll open up to broader questions. But what about the personal as well? Because I'm so grateful, Pat, that you mentioned exactly what it was that you went through. And I think there is this mystery to the Black professor, where there's this assumption that the road is just easy, that these are jobs that are given out like chiclets, like free popcorn someplace, and even at movie theaters, they don't give out free popcorn. But this idea that Black people just emerge and then they get the spots. I know, in fact, that I think that there was litigation following you where someone actually claimed that you took his job, that he was deserving of the job that you got at Wisconsin, I think, right? But for many of us, we began in law teaching even recently as the only ones. When my first law teaching job, there was one other person of color, but I was the only Black person on that faculty until I was able to recruit others. I started off serving on appointment before I even took my first law school job, so that they could have diversity on the committee, and then never stopped, because it was so important at each of my institutions to do that work. And the penalties that we pay, Pat, as you mentioned, you know, there are a number of experiences that we have that we just kind of make our way through. It was in my first semester of law teaching that I actually reported a colleague for sexually harassing a student, where he grabbed a student and licked her at a PILF auction. Now, I reported it to the dean and left it at there, but then many of the things that we hear about now, such as fragility, the dean coming to my office and crying in my office because she had failed to take care of the situation. My colleague becoming all the more aggressive by sending emails to the entire faculty that I was blind and I hadn't seen what I had seen, until his final email where he admitted that he did grab the student and that he did lick her, only he said he gently licked her rather than, as I said, grabbing her and licking her. But licking aside, you know, there are so many issues that we encounter, and yet we're to stay sane and act as if these things didn't occur, and as if there aren't any kind of emotional wounds that result, and to act more mature and more reasonable than everybody else in these situations. So I wanted to open up a little bit more to the personal. What have you encountered? You don't have to tell all, but have you seen struggles along the way, or struggles that other people have experienced that you think law schools could do a better job of?
To whom are you asking this?
Just to
Anybody.
I will say that I had kind of a whiplash effect, because before my first two teaching jobs, I was the only Black woman on both of those faculties. And the job before I came to Howard, I was the first Black woman, if you can believe, ever appointed to a full-time faculty position at University of South Carolina. So at a large public Southern law school. And that was really mind-bending for me to be the first in 2005. And like Professor Williams said, I had to bring others along with me. And like Professor Goodwin was talking about, by the time I left, there were about 6 women of color on that faculty. But it was very, very difficult. And I think sometimes our students, you know, you see them and you want to do so much for them. And at the same time, you realize that, you know, you can't struggle for them unless you have also managed to struggle for yourself in a way that allows you to have some permanency. So during that whole process, I, you know, got tenure, was promoted to full professor, was the first woman, I think, one of the first women on that faculty to have a chair. And all of that struggle while trying to watch
And
out.
what year was that? I don't mean to interrupt, but
2011. That was in
2011.
2011. And became the associate dean there. And so by that time, by the time I left, I think I was probably the highest ranking African-American at the university as an associate dean in the law school. And so there is a huge psychic toll, I think, to that. So when I came to Howard, there was a huge, in many ways, just a huge exhale. Like this, you know, this feeling of, even though Howard, obviously all historically Black colleges, every institution has its own struggles. But there was an exhale in that sense, I think, and the sense that I see my students not struggle in many of the ways that I've witnessed at the 2 other law schools that I've taught at.
So a couple of things. One, particularly for the students, to help them understand the importance of Black faculty. So understanding the struggles of Black faculty is not navel gazing. I think it has direct relevance to the students, because some of the things that nowadays students are talking about how issues of equality and justice, et cetera, are not being taught in the curriculum. Well, I think and I hope that they recognize that the people who've been fighting the long fight to have those issues taught in the curriculum have been Black faculty. And a lot of people have taken hits on their scholarship, mobility, et cetera, as a consequence of doing that work. And part of what people are talking about are the cost of being available as faculty for students as well as for colleagues. So Michelle, you first met Pat as a student. I first met her as a faculty member, and essentially the same set of reactions. So not only did she have to open her arms to you as a student, but she had to do the same for a junior faculty member, right? So we're all looking to faculty, students, undergrad students, law students, fellow faculty members, right, are looking to Black faculty and saying, please help me. I am lonely, I am struggling, support me. And of course, the question is, who gets to support whom, right? So there are burdens that people face, and they have to make decisions about how to address those burdens, but they're directly relevant from my perspective to the student experience, because not only do Black faculty provide so much of the academic, emotional support, et cetera, but also the subjects that we teach the way that we teach them, to try to make our institutions much more hospitable to marginalized students, and particularly to students of color. And so all of us have tried as best as we can to continue to open doors for others in the profession, so that way we could share the load, both for students as well as for each other.
You know, I'm so happy that you mentioned that. And Pat, I'd love to have you join in the conversation on this. But the point that you mentioned about teaching and the issues of evaluations, right, with faculty. So what students want and what Black faculty often do is to make the American experience full and real, which includes people of color and includes Black people. If you're talking about constitutional law, that means more than Dred Scott. Dred Scott is very important in that it's taught well, but there are a host of other cases that address, you know, the inequalities in the United States, whether you're talking about con law, torts, property, across all of these various efforts or areas. Students want that to become real for them. And Black faculty want that too. And we've seen ways in which institutions have not followed through or have incompetently followed through, right? Such that it doesn't have to be that someone covers a curriculum that involves Black life, right? Even though Black life might be at the center of an issue like criminal justice in you know, America. So those are issues that students are struggling with that we should talk about, and that Black faculty also struggle with. I just raised an issue about Derek Bell being at Stanford when white students revolted that they didn't believe that a Black person was qualified, or that Derek Bell as a Black person was qualified to teach constitutional law. And so they revolted and said, we don't have to have a class with him, and went to the dean. And then the dean provided a separate section for those who didn't want to be taught by Derek Bell. Pat, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, even more to your point, up until that time, and when I was in law school and when Derek went to Stanford, con law was taught centered on the Commerce Clause. It wasn't even Dred Scott. The addition of Dred Scott, you know, was racism in the law. It was a separate seminar. Derek Bell was the first faculty that I am aware of in the country who merged what was actually the subject of the jurisprudence, the most contested jurisprudence in constitutional of the 20th century was around civil rights cases. And he brought that part of constitutional law into a basic con law class in a way that it may still feel like all you're studying is the Commerce Clause, but it's so different from what it used to be. And Derek Bell did that. It was that to which his students objected. And so they felt that the inclusion of this material meant that a whole bunch of other stuff must be extruded out the back end. And so they actually went to, at Stanford, what they did was they didn't refuse to be taught by him. They had remedial classes for his students for the stuff that they assumed he was not teaching. The non-race stuff. So the conception of con law as including a study of the history of race or of civil rights is the product of the battle of integrating the faculty for constitutional law. I began my career teaching contracts. You know, contracts, uniform commercial code, and consumer protection. That's what I loved. Nobody associates me with that. Nobody at all. Because frankly, the conversation around my very presence about my body being in the classroom was completely eclipsed about who I was, why I was there. And that's what I ended up writing about to sort of keep myself described and presented, represented in this space. And I still think that what I do is a form of examination of the kinds of private law that is the history of, in contract, the one living body that is at the center of contract is the body of slaves. Surrogate contracts, maybe women's bodies to some extent. But a lot of contract law was formulated, you know, to make efficient exchanges around inanimate objects during the Industrial Revolution. And efficient exchanges over the bodies of slaves. To the degree that human beings are put taken out of the constitutional integrity of the body forum and put into contract law, I think is the definition of our neoliberal moment. We are all living in a neoliberal moment. And it is a race problem, but it is also a general labor problem, health problem. You know, the competition for ventilators alone is a contract problem to some degree that goes all the way back to slavery. And it seems to me that unique jurisprudential perspective is the degree to which we have not yet taught contracts in this more comprehensive sense. And it's why a lot of people outside the country are sort of mystified about what's going on with private law displacing governmental and public health regulations. And, you know, we have a lot of work to do. You have a lot of work to do, and it's not going anywhere. So, you know, the field is open. That's the good part. There is so much good yet to be done.
Well, on that note, and the field, I want to open the discussion to Marquisa, Rachel, comments about what you've heard. A little bit of feedback there. And then Tezra as well. Q&A.
Yeah, I can kind of circle back to the conversation around the personal and the importance of self-care, self-preservation. And that's something that I've preached, I've pushed on all the students that I encounter. Everybody knows that I like to get to business, but I also like to get to the fun and to the relaxation of it all, because I think that is vital to us keeping going and keeping pushing in this fight. I know there's a lot of institutions. Mine is one that provides counseling or the judge and lawyer support groups and things of that nature that are available also to students. I think it's important for us right now, and I know myself as well as other Black students on my campus had experienced not the best type of counseling through those services. So making sure that we're taking a critical lens and seeking out therapists and counselors of color during this time specifically, because I remember going to a free counseling service, and I don't even know how the conversation came up around race and the racial issues. It's probably because that's my life. And the counselor, who was a white woman, was like, well, white men are the targets now. I think it's shifting. And it just turned to this whole conversation of her like not wanting to engage in this and then shifting it to, well, we need to pay attention to how now white men have a target on their backs and da 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 da. And I was just like, okay, so I can't come back. I presented her with an article about white fragility, and I never returned to seek counseling through her. So it's important for us to seek out additional services and support. And I know I wasn't the only student that had negative experiences through counseling services that were provided. So we're kind of forced on our own to seek out other sources of staying grounded, whether it be through meditation. I know there's a couple free meditation apps. The Liberate meditation app is free for us, by us, and they have there's a cost, but they can waive it. It's a great thing to do. Also, the Insight Timer is something that I use regularly. So there's a lot of great resources out here for students, but in general as people. But making sure that we're paying attention to how students, faculty, and staff on campuses, when there aren't a lot of us, we become each other's counsel, we become each other's sounding boards, and that takes a toll on us. We love our friends, we love our fellow students, but we cannot bear that burden on our own. And as much as I want to be able to be that sounding board, I have to take a step back as a person and realize, like, what am I doing to take care of Marquisa in these times? What am I doing to make sure that I'm not overwhelmed and feeling like I need to save the world every day that I wake up, and making sure that I reserve that space and time for myself. So for everyone that's taken on this time and feeling that pressure and that call to stand up and continue fighting, do that mindfully, and do that with awareness of how that is taking a toll on your mental, spiritual, and emotional health.
Thank you for that. Rachel, any comments that you have before we open it up to Q&A?
Sure. I'd love to know from the professor's perspective how non-professors, Black students, or other allies can be supportive of you guys. I know a lot of times Black law students, we look to the Black professors to be kind of a friendly face or some sort of support, but that should be a reciprocal relationship. I know at my university, for example, Professor Kimberly Robinson is now a teacher there, or professor there, and I took her education policy class, and there were 7 people in our class because nobody chose to take her class. No one thought it was interesting, or no one thought she could teach it. There was a lot of confusion and buzz around that. And so when we did our first day of class, she asked everyone to go around and say, well, what's your interest in this class? What's your interest in education policy? And I explained that I have a general interest in education and just learning, but I'm here to support Black professors. And I looked at all my other classmates and they were very shocked that I said that, but I meant it. And Professor Robinson pulled me aside after and thanked me because she felt like no one else was going to say that. And she was very shocked that I did. So I'd love to hear how we can be more supportive of you all. And I saw a few questions in the Q&A box from allies who want to be more vocal and be more supportive, and or make themselves more visible so people know that they can use them as a resource. And I would say one thing I always encourage people to do, especially allies, is don't make a Black friend, make a friend. Find ways to humanize yourself to others and find the human in them, because it's not weird friend to friend if you ask me a question about me as a person, and part of being who I am is a Black person. So that's okay. But if we don't have that trust, we don't have that foundational relationship, it's very odd, or it's odd on both sides sometimes to engage in that sort of difficult conversation. So I would encourage you all to just make yourselves visible, reach out and ask questions, invite people to coffee, just to show that, hey, you know, I see you and I want to be your friend. I want to be your ally. And maybe don't even start with a conversation about race. Just, you know, like, where are you from? Do you like sports? You know, simple things that we all do. Sometimes are taken for granted when we see the surface and think, oh, there's no way we could possibly have anything in common, but we're all humans, so we must have something. So I'd love to hear the professor's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Danielle, Guy, you know, Pat, any comments on that? And before we begin, I would like to touch on how challenging faculty appointments and hiring can be. You know, it's still as if these positions are sometimes treated as if they're the property, and the fight over the property of who will be brought in. And across the country, I've heard from Black law professors, and I've been on the committees myself, when it's been very difficult to bring out of committee even Black Supreme Court clerks. These are not the stories that you want to tell to your colleagues once they've been hired, but the reality is that there is a different bar that is set for Black faculty. I have seen it. There are others who've written about it and who've talked about it. You know, there's a scholarship on implicit bias, and some say it's not implicit, it's explicit. But you certainly, at the very least, see the implicit bias that goes on when candidates of color are being vetted for academic slots. And if there aren't Black faculty at the law school and on those committees, then it makes it very difficult, sadly, even in these times, to bring Black faculty through committees and onto the faculty. Or you might see instances where a Black candidate actually gets the vote and the offer. But, you know, as Professor Williams has written about microaggressions and the ability to sense things, there may be people who've gotten offers, but were not treated very well on their time when they were visiting at the law school, either the short visit where they gave their talk and went to dinner, or on a longer visit where they spent time and taught a course. You know, there's not this sense of actually looking back at, you know, the institution side, like, how welcoming are you? Have you done the real work with actually recruiting this Black faculty? Or is it that you were simply tossing a bone and expecting for the puppy to come and gather? And I know that sounds, it has a kind of visceral and alliterative kind of sound, but in reality, when Black faculty are able to talk amongst themselves, they share some of these real horror stories, and sometimes try to bring a little bit of levity to it. But to your point, Rachel, it is really important to think about the kind of synergistic relationship that faculty and students can have with addressing what is a long-standing problem with a real legacy in the United States. Guy, Pat, Danielle, were you going to say something on any of those points?
I was going to add something about allies or the advice to allies, because I think right now we're going through a moment in which there are many, many people who want to participate and want to do the right thing. And I really wanted to underscore the value of just asking questions. There are so many people who, Dean Holly Walker talked about making statements. We don't want just statements, we want action. And I want to add to that, we also don't need more apologies. I mean, I really appreciate apologies. I know it comes from a good place. But if one more person comes to me and apologizes on behalf of all white people, you know, I won't be as polite as I was at the beginning of this cycle. You know? It's like, I really, really appreciate it. I appreciate where it comes from, but I think the apology is, you know, the idea that you need to look behind what is it that causes the guilt for the apology to begin with. And that's maybe where the action ultimately will be found, or the seed for the need of apologizing. Because apologizing puts the burden on the person of color to be the father confessor, to grant the absolution, to make you feel better. And I think that, as well-meaning as that is, it's not constructive, and it ends up really, it defeats, again, the way in which an open-ended question, you know, I'm ignorant, tell me, what does this mean? And again, I exclude from that category of open questions, what does it feel like to be Black? Don't ask that question either. But you know, I once wrote a story called My Best White Friend, and I wrote it as a kind of reversal, because I had a friend who kept calling me. She would introduce me, so this is my best Black friend. And she would say Black friend, and she was always underscoring the fact that clearly I was the only Black friend she had, or the only Black person she knew. And I think that sense of what does it mean if we really encounter each other without that necessary qualification. It's not a descriptor, that's a qualification. And to recognize it as such, and really think about why we need that we mark each other in that way, or we mark particularly people of color. And that's a marker of difference, not a sign of real friendship.
Guy, Danielle, would you like to chime in before we go to the Q&A?
Sure, very quickly. So I want to both pick up on your point about how on Black faculty hiring. It is difficult, as so many of us know. There have been many institutions that have been very, very slow to hire Black faculty. We know that. You can simply look at the websites and just look at when was the last time this institution hired a Black person. It's very easy to figure that out. So that's a significant difficulty. And one of the things that students can do that I think can have both benefits for the students as well as for their institutions and, quite frankly, the profession, is to be sure that they are preparing the way for themselves for the future. Right, which means that you all ought to have aspirations to be Black faculty, and you ought to be sure that that path is open to you, and you could assure that that path is open to you by encouraging and holding your institutions accountable to assure that they hire Black faculty and faculty of color, that it is normalized, that it is not an exceptional thing. It is not in every 5 or 7 years we hire one person, right? So that's a level of mutual support that works both ways, but I think that also has benefits for those of you who are currently students by paving the way for yourselves and opening that path. And that enables the institutions to become much less lonely for everyone, students, staff, faculty as well.
If I could just
Yes.
jump in, sorry, Dean Holly Walker, and then since you have yet to speak about this, there seems to be some chatter in the Q&A about faculty retention, that is also, Black faculty retention is also a concern. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. There are someone said that they are at a law school that has a large Black presence in the community, but there are still very few Black faculty. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what law schools can do to support Black faculty and make sure that they are promoted to full tenure positions, and then any other thoughts you have about generally hiring Black faculty.
Thank you so much for that question. I saw some of those questions in the Q&A. I want to echo everything that has been said about how difficult it is inside of our institutions to hire Black faculty in the first place. And then once they get there, to make sure that we are supporting Black faculty, I think is just incredibly important. I think as students, I love that story that Rachel told about one of my favorite colleagues who writes in the same area about Professor Robinson. She is outstanding, and for you to support her in that way just really, was impressive on your part. And I think something that is tangible that every student can do. I think in terms of retaining Black faculty, we need to, one of the most pressing things is you are in service from the moment that you're there. So as Professor Goodwin talked about, serving on appointments committee from the first year, I remember doing something very similar at my first law school. I think to really understand that faculty, in order to get promoted, need to have time to write and do scholarship at the same time as they are supportive. And we all are called to do that. I think it's very hard to focus sometimes on your scholarship and teaching when you feel pulled in so many different directions. I think that things like student evaluations, unfortunately, even though they shouldn't matter as much in tenure files, they do matter. Support your faculty, when you write student evaluations. Know when your faculty members are about to go up for tenure and write them supportive notes in their file. Every, letter that a faculty member gets from a student that says, you were the best professor that I had. You really took time out to help Balsa this year. You really went out of your way. All of those things can be very helpful to Black faculty in terms of their promotion and their tenure. I think also just being, many students serve on committees. And if you end up serving on committees where you can be supportive in more tangible ways, curriculum committees, et cetera, sometimes you even in some places you get to interview faculty. If you don't see any Black faculty coming through to be interviewed, ask questions about that. I think it's really important that students raise their voice in that way. But I think students as a support system for faculty is something that we don't always think about, but I see us as one community.
All right, teases up another question then, Tezra.
Okay, so we just received a question, I think a very important question, about how Black law students can aspire to appreciate the American jurisprudence when that story is fundamentally rooted in our oppression. And so professors, if you have any advice on kind of navigating that, I think I speak for myself and probably many Black law students in acknowledging that it is truly a struggle being in the con law class or the contracts class or the tax class where race is obviously, to me, a key part of the issues in the cases that we're reading, but maybe not necessarily taught that way.
Who wants to take that on? Pat, Guy, and I'd love for us to come back to retention before we leave to spend more time on that, because that's a really important issue.
Throughout my career, and particularly when I needed to write it all down as anecdotes, it is a very hard task, as you framed it, to think about how to locate oneself inside an entire jurisprudential system that is fundamentally rooted on your oppression. And so I have found it helpful to write down even the inconsequential things that happen in a class or that happen in a dorm room, or right now I've my last several years have been on urban campuses where there have been such very different perceptions among white and Black students or students of color between, you know, how they see the neighborhood and where they get apartments and classes, all of that. Write it all down. Even if you can't confront it in the moment, keep a journal, keep a written memory of it, because you will come back to it and use it in your final argument in a case several years from now. Or you'll be able to write the Board of Trustees as an alumnus in a few years. Or you'll be able to bring it up in that immediate faculty meeting as this is an example of where, or the consequence of what you're doing. So I think that I view myself as witnessing constantly. And that makes it manageable and locates me not as encountering the entire institution, but as somebody who bears an offering to a collective project of observation, a little bit like the old handwritten version. I mean, it's the jurisprudential version of dash cams and videos and surveillance. I mean, we have this technology with a new vocabulary of observation that may or may not be, you know, ideal, but in the old-fashioned witnessing of what is going wrong, and then creating you know, a pool of that knowledge and recollection, I think is, you know, be generous with it. Hand it on again to your colleagues and your classmates for.
Guy, were you going to jump in there?
Yes, please. So I want to build on something that Pat had said earlier, which is there is a hopefulness about this moment. Those of us in Legal Academy see many of our colleagues of color, as well as our white colleagues who are rethinking their pedagogical approaches. There's a wonderful article by Ann Conklin at UVA, the draft article, it's called Teaching Against the Case. I don't know if she'll change the title, but it's thinking about, look, how do we teach these types of cases differently so that we're not asking people to participate and validate their own oppression. And there's a rethinking in this moment about legal pedagogy that I think will open up the avenues for all of us to engage in a deeper way. I remember the first time I read some of these cases when I was a law student, particularly con law, but not just in con law, but also in contracts. Some of us who were at Michigan when we were law students, everyone would get together, every once in a while we'll talk about some of those stories. I remember how reading those cases, it made feel, and to the extent that I was being asked to participate in my own oppression. And I think we're rethinking those approaches. And to the extent that you find yourself in a space that isn't quite doing that, you can not only encourage your professor, but you could also get together as students to think about how to reimagine, how to reteach, how to reconceptualize the material so that you can find yourself. Because part of what to me is interesting about the American legal story is that it has its valleys as well as its peaks. It has its positive moments and its negative moments, right? So how can we reconceptualize parts of our jurisprudence and to frame it around the parts that matter most strongly for the type of justice work that so many of us are engaged in?
What an excellent discussion. And you know, and you flag that, you know, the exclusion of the exclusion of people of color across the curriculum. And then there are areas in which Black people can be added to the curriculum. You know, I was just the other day listening to audio from Carol Mosley Braun taking on a patent for the Daughters of the Confederate. She was fresh to the Senate, the first Black woman senator elected, one of only two who served in the entire last century. And she stood up and said that the design patent shouldn't be extended for the Daughters of the Confederacy, for the Confederate flag, you know. And it's very interesting. There would be people who say, well, there's nothing about Black people that involves patent law And yet the very origins actually do. And so sadly, some of this also means students having to educate themselves and the professors who may not be aware of these kinds of things. Tezra, what else do we have in the queue? It looks like we've got lots of questions.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. So one question is about how, and I think these two so there are two questions that are similar, that are related, about how professors and or non-teaching staff, for example, Office of Career Planning professionals, can combat the diversity questions, like what diversity do you bring to our law firm for students? That tends to be quite a heavy question. And then relatedly, what can faculty and students do to increase diversity in those career planning offices? One person who wrote this question said that their entire team consists of white women. So they are wondering how to increase diversity.
This is really a critical question, I think, and one that, I've seen play out time and time again, that even if we ask the questions about Black faculty, for our students to be successful, we have to ask the questions about, do we have proper diversity in career services, student affairs? Academic success and bar preparation is one of the key offices that we know can actually reinforce lots of racial stereotypes if it is not done in a way that is sensitive to the needs of all students. I think one thing we have to do is develop more pipeline and training programs to go into law school leadership and into academic leadership. We have several programs, and one that Guy does that's amazing, that helps to look at VAP programs that help to promote Black faculty. And I think we have to do the same for staff. So we just hired a recent graduate from Howard to be our assistant director of career services. And we noticed that when they go to NALP conferences, our staff and the staff from other HBCUs, those are often the few African Americans in the room. So it's really important that we develop more pipeline programs for law school staff. And so that graduates, young graduates from law school, think about going into student affairs, think about going into career services. And I think with questions about firms that ask those kinds of questions, at Howard, we are a top 25 producer of big law associates. And so I spent a lot of time talking to big law partners and hiring directly about what it means to recruit and retain Black associates and to make Black partners. And I think at this point in 2020, there's really no point, as Professor Williams said, in being polite anymore. We just need to tell them, you need to stop asking that question, right? You should report it to career services if someone asks you a question like that. And then the firm needs to be told, don't ask that question anymore, right? You won't interview on campus with us. And you just really, the time has passed to pretend that you don't understand that that is not an appropriate question to ask. And so I think it really, you have to face off on those questions in a much more direct way than I think maybe we've done in the past. And I encourage all career services offices to really hold their firms and the employers who come on their campus accountable.
Great answer. Tezra?
Yeah, so another question is, what can Black law students do to fight racial injustice before they complete law school? Like, what are some small things? I know we talked about, making sure we take care of ourselves, but what are some small things that law students can do while in law school, or large?
Anybody want to? I'll start and then ask for anybody to jump in. It is really critical, as Professor Williams said, to really take care of yourself, because Black students invest a lot, and Black students help to serve other students. Faculty, it can take away from the time that they would otherwise spend on their reading assignments and other things. And so good mental health is really important. Meditation, yoga is critically important. There are actually some law schools that have begun yoga programs, and I encourage you to do so. And for any Black person wondering about Black folks in yoga, you know that Rosa Parks was a yogi herself. So it really is important to take care of mind, body, and soul, because let's be clear, part of the health disparities that we see is not because Black people have different genes or anything like that, that Black people are born biologically inferior. It's all of the toxicity that is experienced in the day-to-day life, what you experienced as you were walking down the street, what you experienced by your colleagues, what you experienced by the security guard who wondered whether or not you are really a student who deserves to be in the building, the microaggressions that you experienced in the class where the professor targeted you on the Brown v. Board of Education case or some other kind of thing that white students just don't get targeted about. Then going to pick up your dinner at night, getting microaggressions there. I mean, the reality is that kind of level of toxicity on a day-to-day basis. I mean, people don't even think about it. I mean, it's hard enough for people to think about Black people being shot unarmed. But the reality is there's a lot of tensions and stress that Black people experience, whether you're the students, whether you happen to be the staff who are serving the meals to the faculty, whether you happen to be a member of the faculty, so many levels. And so taking care of the mental health is really, really important.
So I have a question for the law students, Marquisa and Rachel. What can the student affairs offices do to better support Black students? Are there specific trainings and programs that the law school could pay for or put on that would benefit Black students?
Sure, but before I do that, I wanted to backtrack. I think when it comes to any kind of social action that law students are interested in before you graduate, at the National Black Law Students Association, we are working with local law school chapters in hopes of mobilizing more of our efforts in organizing. So if you email socialaction@NABALSA, and I'll put that in the chat.org, we can help support you and connect with you with what we're trying to do and hopefully align so that you can get involved with the different campaigns that we're hoping to develop and implement this year. So I just wanted to add on that. In terms of supporting Black law students, I would say one thing that my law school does very recently is make implicit bias training mandatory as part of orientation for all students. And I was really, really surprised that they did that, and I loved it. I didn't get to participate. It was the year after I started, but it was run by a Black woman and another partner she had with her, and she talked about implicit bias and had that discussion. I think one thing I would do at my school is hopefully expand that conversation and have it as an ongoing series, not just a one-time, oh, let me just like suffer through this for orientation, but more so like, no, this is the conversation we have here. This is what we want to talk about. You know, creating those spaces to have those conversations is important, and making people aware of them so that everyone knows that, oh, the law school is serious about this, or this isn't something I can just brush off, or regardless, I have to participate because it's not optional. You know, making it so that everybody's got to get in the room and at least get through it, if nothing else. And that starts that chain of thought and understanding that this is something that we're taking seriously. So creating that space externally, and also creating a space internally for Black law students to voice their concerns and voice their frustrations and just listen. Don't try to justify what they're upset about. Don't try to correct them on something, just hear them out. Like, have a lunch and let them share with you about what they're not happy about or what they are happy about and how you can support them. Just having that conversation, and like Professor Williams said, ask the questions, you know, ask people, what do they want? What do they need? What are we doing well? And just take that feedback, absorb it, and then maybe follow up later on. But in that conversation, let them share that space with you. And if they see that you are receptive, it's a really great way to build that trust and that relationship where they feel like they can be heard and will bring more to you that you maybe wouldn't even expected. And the last thing I wanted to add, someone asked, when it comes to programming, how do you bring in people who are maybe not necessarily aware of what the issues are? Because a lot of times, I heard a quote that speeches are heard by people who already know, right? And so a lot of times these programs, even with non-Black attendees that are hosted by BALSA, are attended by people who already support us, already understand, or to some degree, what's going on. I would encourage you to start small. It's about low stakes opportunities for people to test the waters. Maybe don't make it a whole event. Like, for example, maybe have an allyship like social or a cookout, like just, or a party, like something where people can passively engage in a way that doesn't make them feel like, oh, I'm overcommitting, or it's like, oh, I have to have X amount of knowledge or X amount of Black friends to be a part of this. If you find ways that make it safe psychologically for people to engage and just be a part of that environment, it'll help build that opportunity for them to show themselves or just passively get involved where they can build their understanding, and maybe you can catch a wider audience than you maybe normally would. Also, of course, partnering with other organizations. Say there's an environmental law society at your school, get involved with them. The environment affects Black people. Hello, Flint, Michigan. So like, let's be clear about what everything is impacted by Black students, and Black students are impacted by everything. So don't limit yourself when it comes to your programming about just social action issues or just specific issues that you see in the news. Get creative with who you're working with, and that'll help as well to get a larger audience of who you're trying to impact.
And it looks like, and Marquise, I'd love to hear your perspective from that, and want to tease up in the remaining 10 minutes that we have. There are questions that have come in a lot, so thank you for tuning in and joining us. But there have been questions raised about U.S. News and World Report, about admissions, getting back to issues involving retention, social justice. I think if anything, what our time together reflects is that we need more time on all of this. That here it is in an hour and a half with ACS. We're lifting up these experiences in a way that's just simply not taking place as a normal activity at law schools in the United States. So I want to open up that bounty, if you will. Would you like to comment on anything from admissions and retention to U.S. News and World Report, social justice?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, and it kind of goes along the lines of how are we admitting and retaining students of color, specifically Black students, but also coupling that with the ways in which we can support the students already on campus. And I think I put this in a bit in my opening, but cut a check. Put your money where your mouth is. It is so important. I've been saying this for so long. It's not like I'm out here money hungry with green eyeballs, but it is very important to put your money where your mouth is, protect and promote and fund Black spaces, and create opportunities like this that had we not been experiencing a global pandemic, we would not be in the same space. So making sure that we are providing opportunities for Black students to be in spaces that are created for them, and protected and obtained for them, whether that be through NABOLSA or any other organizations that are putting on programming that is specifically tied in promoting Black student life. And then in terms of admission and retention, I think making sure that our pre-law students have that information early on, and making sure that they know the ins and outs of you need to apply early, there's access to this type of LSAT training or preparation, things of that nature, making sure that that information that we take for granted now being on the other side is being funneled down to the folks coming after us. So those are just two things that I wanted to highlight there.
All right. Other comments to that? Otherwise, we can go to more questions in the queue. All right. Tessa.
Okay. So professors, one question that has popped up a little bit is, what can junior faculty or faculty without institutional power do to support Black students and advocate them with faculty, with admin at law schools as a whole?
Guy, I'd like to pivot to you in that, not to put you on the spot, but you've spent some time in recent years along with Dorothy Brown, but now I know that there have been transitions with the program, but you've led one of the most powerful programs, one of the most powerful pipelines in landing faculty of color in positions at American law schools. What is the kind of feedback after they've left the program in terms of, how they're making it at these institutions, and building on the question that Tezra pulled up from the queue, how can they be engaged in helping students when in fact they are vulnerable too?
Sure. So Dorothy Brown deserves a lot of the credit for this, and I want to be sure that she gets it at Emory for having the vision to provide a pipeline program for junior faculty. And just very quickly how this works, it's twofold, where the program supports academics of color who are aspiring to be legal academics, to help them get jobs. And then once they get jobs, support them through the tenure process. And part of what we encourage people to do now, to answer the question, and this ties into a lot of the comments that have been made, that Rachel made, Marquisa made, Dean Daniel Holly Walker made, that you are a full person as a faculty member. And there are trade-offs. So you have to take care of yourself. You have to take care of your scholarship. You have to take care of students. You have to participate in university and law school governance. You have to participate in university governance. You have work-life balance, right? So there are lots of things that people have to think through. We are full people, and people have to make certain sets of choices, and they have to give as much as they can while recognizing the limits of their own personal vulnerability. And so we encourage our junior faculty to be full members of the community and to support whatever they think is important for them to support. As you do that, you are also taking care of the other things you need to be taken care of. You are working on your scholarship. You are taking care of your teaching. You are protecting yourself in many ways. You're protecting your mental health, but you're also making sure that you do the type of scholarship that you need to do. So from my perspective, building part of what we do in this is just to build community with each other. And we have allies. We have white faculty who support and participate. Institutions, Duke has long supported this. Stanford has supported it, and other institutions. Next year, Chicago will be supporting it. So you build community in order to accomplish the various goals that one has, which is really to be a full member of the community. So if there's a student, Black student that you want to advocate for, if you're a junior person, then advocate for them. Right? People are autonomous agents who are making choices and recognizing both what potential change they could effect, but also their limitations, and working within their limitations in order to achieve their potential. And that's the way that we think about it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this.
So we are coming to the end of our time. I want to thank those of you who have joined us as guests to help us lift up these issues, as well as those who are tuning in. This has been a pleasure to be with you, Professor Williams, Professor Guy Charles Uriel, and also Dean Holly Walker, Rachel Barnes, Marquisa Wentz, and Tezra Abe. I want to thank the American Constitution Society for hosting this event. We had many questions in our queue, so much more to be able to get to, and I think it only demonstrates how important these conversations are and the importance of us coming back and doing it again. So thank you all. Really appreciate your being here with us. And in the chat, there have been some information put in as to next steps. Thank you, Rachel, for doing that. And thank you all, and a good night to you all. Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Thank
Pat.
you, Michelle.
Thank you, Marquisa.
Thank you.
So much, everyone.
So nice to see you all. I haven't seen you in years.
You.
Uriel and Guy, it's really nice to see you, and nice
Wonderful
to see you.
to see you, Pat.
Yeah, it has been wonderful. Take care.
Great to see you, Guy, and thank you, Danielle, and Zanelle, and
Thank you,
Penny.
Danielle, for organizing this.
Great to see you, Guy.
Thanks to all of you. Fantastic conversation. Really.
Until next time.
Yes.
Until next time.
Until next time.
When did you go to Duke, Guy?
2008.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It has been a while. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Two new faculty members joining you, right, Guy?
Dude, Tim Lovelace.
That's right. Tim is great.
And Gina Gale Fletcher.
Oh, I love Gina. She's one of my